Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight, we're drifting into Mordor, the ancient land of shadow in Tolkien's Middle-earth, where mountains rise like iron walls and the weight of history rests beneath volcanic ash. Let this be your moment to settle. The world outside can wait. We're exploring the deep history of this darkened realm, its creation in ages past, the building of the great tower Barad-dûr, the servants who dwelt within its borders, and the quiet aftermath when the fires finally dimmed. Some discoveries may surprise you. Others will simply drift by like ash on a warm wind. If this helps you unwind, a like helps others find their way here too. But for now, let's begin our journey into the shadows and mysteries of Mordor. The land that would become Mordor was shaped in the earliest days of the world, when the great powers walked upon Arda, and the continents themselves were still being formed. The mountains that encircle this realm, the arid Lithui to the north and the Efelduath to the west and south, were not natural formations born from the slow work of geological ages. These ranges were raised deliberately as fortifications, their peaks thrust upward by the will of Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, during the tumultuous wars of the First Age. He built these barriers as ramparts against the powers of the West, creating a stronghold in the eastern lands far from Valinor. The mountains stand like ancient sentinels, their ridges sharp as broken blades, their slopes steep and treacherous. When the wind blows across their heights, it carries no birdsong, only the sound of stone grinding against stone, a reminder of the violent birth that brought them into being. Within the embrace of these mountain walls lies the plateau of Gorgoroth, a vast plain of volcanic rock and hardened ash. The surface here is dark and cracked, broken into jagged fragments by centuries of heat and pressure from the earth below. In the northwestern part of this desolate plateau rises Orodruin, the mountain of fire, its cone reaching toward the perpetually clouded sky. This volcano has been active since before the coming of the elves to Middle-earth, its fires burning deep within the roots of the mountain. The name Orodruin means fire mountain in Sindarin, the language of the Grey Elves, and those who have glimpsed it from afar speak of the red glow that emanates from its peak, casting an angry light across the surrounding wasteland. The heat from Orodruin can be felt for miles around, making the air shimmer and dance even in the depths of night, while the scent of sulfur hangs thick in the atmosphere. To the south and east of Gorgoroth, the land descends toward the Sea of Nurnen, a vast inland body of water whose shores mark the only fertile lands within Mordor's borders. The waters of Nurnen are bitter to taste, unsuitable for drinking, yet they teem with fish that have adapted to their mineral-rich composition. Around the seas, perimeter lie fields that were worked for thousands of years, first by free peoples and later by those who labored under the dominion of Sauron. The soil here, fed by runoff from the mountains and enriched by ash from distant Orodruin, can grow crops when tended with sufficient effort. In the Third Age, these lands provided sustenance for the armies gathered in Mordor, their harvests reaped by peoples who had been conquered and displaced from their original homes. The contrast between Nurnen's relative fertility and the barren waste of Gorgoroth is striking. Here at the southern edge, life persists despite the shadow that hangs over all. The climate of Mordor is harsh and inhospitable, shaped by its volcanic activity and the encircling mountains that trap air within the basin. The skies above are often dark with clouds of ash and smoke, blocking much of the sun's light and creating a perpetual twilight even at midday. rain falls rarely, and when it does come, it carries the taste of ash and minerals. The temperatures in Gorgoroth can be extreme, scorching during the day when heat radiates from the black rock, then plunging into bitter cold at night when that same stone releases its warmth into the thin air. The winds that blow across this land are unpredictable and violent, sometimes howling through the mountain passes with enough force to knock a traveler from their feet. In the depths of Mordor, far from any ocean influence, the air itself feels different, drier, heavier with particles of volcanic dust that catch in the throat and sting the eyes. Before Sauron came to dwell in this land, before the name Mordor was even spoken with dread, these mountains and plains existed in a state of terrible emptiness. After Morgoth was cast into the void at the end of the First Age, his strongholds in the north were broken, and his servants were scattered or destroyed. The region that would become Mordor lay abandoned for nearly 1,000 years of the Second Age, a forgotten corner of Middle-earth where few ventured and fewer still chose to remain. During this time, the mountains stood silent, the volcano smoldered quietly, and the land began to heal in its own way from the violence of its creation. Small communities of men may have lived on the edges of this territory, particularly near Nornen, where the land was less hostile. But the heart of Gorgoroth remained untouched, a wilderness of stone and ash, where only the hardiest creatures could survive. It was around the year 1000 of the Second Age that Sauron, greatest of Morgoth's servants who had escaped destruction, began to seek a new stronghold. After spending the early centuries of that age in various forms and guises, sometimes working in secret among the elves of Eregion, under the fair appearance of Anatar, he recognized the need for a fortress from which to command his growing power. His gaze turned eastward to the land encircled by the arid Lithue and Ethel Duath. The strategic advantages were immediately apparent. Mountains that formed natural fortifications, a volcano that could provide the intense heat necessary for his forge, and isolation from the realms of elves and men in the west. This choice would reshape the history of Middle-earth for the next 5,000 years. Sauron began the construction of Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, in the year 1000 of the Second Age. The location he chose was in the northwestern part of Gorgoroth, not far from the Mountain of Fire, where the foundations could be laid upon solid volcanic rock. The building of this fortress was not accomplished in decades or even centuries. It required 600 years of continuous labor to complete. The tower was designed to be the greatest stronghold ever built in Middle-earth, surpassing even the fortresses of Morgoth in the ancient north. Its foundations were sunk deep into the living rock, anchored with the power that Sauron would soon forge into the One Ring. The walls were constructed of black stone, incredibly hard and nearly impervious to siege weapons or the erosive power of time, rising tier upon tier until the topmost pinnacle stood at an immense height. The physical scale of Barad-dûr defied easy description. From its base to its highest point, the tower soared above the surrounding plain, visible for countless miles in every direction. The structure was not a single, thin spire, but rather a massive complex of walls, battlements, dungeons, and halls, all oriented around the central tower. Its architecture was designed to inspire dread. No graceful curves or elegant proportions, but rather stark angles and overwhelming mass. A monument to power and domination. Windows were rare and always narrow, mere slits in the thick walls, and the great gate that faced westward was flanked by iron doors of tremendous weight. Within the tower were chambers where Sauron conducted his work, dungeons that descended into darkness, armories that could outfit vast armies, and, at the very summit, a chamber where the Eye of Sauron would keep watch over all the land. To construct something of this magnitude required resources and labor on an unprecedented scale. Sauron commanded the orcs who dwelt in the mountains to quarry the black stone, and he compelled men from the east and south to labor on the construction. The work was dangerous, and many perished in accidents or from the harsh conditions, but the tower grew nonetheless, year by year, level by level. The design incorporated certain elements of power that went beyond mere physical construction. Sauron wove his will into the very stones, creating a fortress that was bound to him in ways both material and metaphysical. This connection would prove crucial, for when the One Ring was destroyed at the end of the Third Age, Barad-dûr would fall not through assault, but through the breaking of the power that sustained its foundations. In the year 1600 of the Second Age, Sauron completed a work that would define his nature and his fate. In the depths of Mount Doom, within the Samath Naur, the chambers of fire where the heat of the volcano burned hottest, he forged the One Ring. This was not merely a ring of power like the others he had helped to create. It was a receptacle for a great portion of his own native power, a means of controlling all the other rings and dominating their bearers. The inscription upon the ring, visible only when heated, was written in the black speech that Sauron had devised. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. The creation of this object fundamentally changed Sauron's existence. He became more powerful than before, able to exert his will across great distances, but he also became vulnerable in a way he had not been previously. The ring itself was deceptively simple in appearance, a plain band of gold, neither jeweled nor ornate, yet it possessed properties that marked it as something beyond ordinary craft. It could make its bearer invisible by shifting them partially into the Wraith world, the Twilight realm where the Nazgûl dwelt. It enhanced the natural abilities of those who wore it, granting them extended life and heightened perception, but at a terrible cost. The ring was inherently corrupting, designed to dominate and control, and it slowly worked its influence on any who possessed it, turning their desires toward power and domination regardless of their original intentions. The ring sought always to return to its master, exerting a subtle pull on the minds of those near it, whispering promises of power while gradually enslaving them to Sauron's will. The reason the ring could only be destroyed in the fires where it was made lay in the nature of its creation. Sauron had poured his power into the ring in a process that was, in some ways, irreversible. The gold and the spell and his own essence had become one substance. No ordinary fire, no matter how hot, could unmake this binding. Only the specific heat of Mount Doom, the same flames that had witnessed the ring's birth, could undo the working. This was not a weakness Sauron anticipated becoming relevant. He could not imagine any circumstance in which an enemy would choose to destroy such power rather than attempting to use it. This blindness to the possibility of rejection and renunciation would prove to be his ultimate undoing. The foundations of Barad-dûr were laid with the power of the ring woven into the very stones. This was done during the long years of construction, with Sauron placing his mark upon the deepest levels of the fortress. The result was a structure that, while immensely strong in its own right, derived part of its coherence from the continued existence of the One Ring. The tower and the ring were bound together, one to the other, in a relationship of mutual dependence. As long as the ring existed, Barad-dûr would stand against any force. No army could throw it down, no earthquake could topple it, no erosion of time could wear it away. But should the ring be destroyed, the power binding those foundations would fail, and the entire structure would collapse as if it had never been. The entrances to Mordor were few and carefully guarded, for Sauron was ever wary of invasion. The primary gate was the Morannon, the Black Gate, built across the main pass through the arid Lithui in the northwest. This was a massive fortification with two great towers, Carchost and Narchost, the Towers of the Teeth, standing on either side of the pass. The gates themselves were constructed of iron and black stone, each valve so heavy that it required great mechanism to open and close them. When shut, they formed an impenetrable barrier, and when open, the passage between them was watched by countless warriors stationed in the towers and along the walls. The Morannon faced toward the lands of Gondor, toward the realm of men who had once stood against Sauron in alliance with the elves, and it stood as both a defensive barrier and a promise of future aggression. Another crucial pass lay to the west, where the Ethel Duath curved northward. Here was Cirith Ungol, the Pass of the Spider, a high and treacherous path that climbed through the mountains. This pass was not fortified with iron gates and towers like the Morannon, for it had a guardian of a different kind. Shelob, the great spider, descendant of Ungoliant, who had darkened the light of the two trees in the elder days, made her lair in the tunnels and caves near the pass. Sauron knew of her presence and left her undisturbed, for she served his purposes well. Few who entered her tunnels emerged alive, and those who did were often too weakened to continue. A tower, Cirith Ungol itself, was built on the far side of the pass, manned by orcs who watched for any who might somehow survive the spider's hunger. The passage through Cirith Ungol was a nightmare of darkness and web-strung tunnels. Shelob had dwelt in these mountains for ages uncounted, growing vast and terrible in her solitude. She was not a servant of Sauron in the way that orcs or men might serve him. She acknowledged no master and obeyed no commands. She was an appetite, a hunger that had existed since before the rising of the sun, and she cared for nothing beyond feeding that endless craving. Her webs were strong as cables, sticky and clinging, designed to trap and hold her prey until she could inject them with her venom. The poison did not kill, but rather paralyzed, preserving the victim alive but helpless while she fed. The darkness in her tunnels was absolute, a blackness that seemed to have weight and substance, pressing against the eyes and mind of anyone who dared to enter. Within Mordor itself, the population was diverse, though all were united in their service to Sauron, whether willingly or through compulsion. The orcs formed the bulk of the military forces, bred and trained for warfare. These creatures came in many varieties, some smaller and suited for swift raids, others larger and stronger, capable of bearing heavy armor and weapons. The orcs of Mordor were generally darker-skinned than those who dwelt in other regions, with eyes that glowed reddish in the dark, and voices that grated like stone on stone. They organized themselves into tribes and companies, each with its own captains and hierarchies, though all ultimately answered to the will of Sauron or his appointed lieutenants. Despite their reputation for cruelty and violence, orcs were not mindless. They had language, culture of a sort, and the capacity for cunning and strategy. The Uruk-hai were sometimes confused with the orcs of Mordor, but they were distinct creations. While Saruman the White bred his own strain of Uruk-hai and Isengard, Sauron had developed his own breeds of larger, stronger orcs that could tolerate sunlight better than their smaller cousins. These warriors were used as elite troops, capable of forced marches and sustained combat. They stood taller than common orcs, with broader shoulders and greater strength, and they bore better weapons and armor. Their creation involved dark sorcery, crossbreeding different strains of orcs over many generations, selecting for size and ferocity while attempting to reduce the traditional orcish weakness to daylight. Trolls also served in Sauron's armies, particularly a breed known as the Olog-hai. These creatures were larger and more terrible than the common trolls of the mountains, and they had been bred or altered to overcome the ancient curse that turned their kind to stone in sunlight. The Olog-hai could fight by day as well as by night, making them formidable warriors. They were not intelligent in the way that men or elves were intelligent, but they possessed a low cunning and could follow complex orders when properly commanded. Their strength was immense. A single Olog-hai could wield weapons that would require 3 men to lift, and they could smash through walls or gates that would resist any other force. In battle, they were often used as shock troops, sent to break enemy formations and create chaos in the ranks. Men also dwelt in Mordor and served Sauron, though their circumstances varied greatly. Some came from the east and south: Easterlings, Haradrim, and Varyags of Khand, who had been dominated by Sauron's power or corrupted by promises of wealth and conquest. These men retained their own cultures and languages to some degree, serving as auxiliary troops or in specialized roles. Others were descended from the Black Númenóreans, men of the Island Kingdom who had followed Sauron in the Second Age when he was captured and brought to Númenor, eventually corrupting that realm from within. These descendants preserved some of the lore and knowledge of Númenor, though twisted to dark purposes, and they served Sauron as administrators, sorcerers, and commanders. The most terrible of Sauron's servants were the Ice Nazgûl, the Ring Wraiths, the 9 who had once been great kings of men. In the Second Age, Sauron had distributed 9 rings of power to mighty rulers, some from the lands that would later be called Gondor and Arnor, others from kingdoms in the east and south. These rings granted extended life, enhanced power, and the ability to work great deeds, but they also bound their bearers to the One Ring and to Sauron's will. Over centuries, the 9 kings faded from the world of the living, becoming wraiths who existed in the shadow world, neither alive nor dead. They lost all memory of their former lives, their names forgotten even to themselves, and they became extensions of Sauron's will, his most powerful and terrible servants. The leader of the Nazgûl was the Witch King of Angmar, a figure who had terrorized the northern kingdoms of Middle-earth for centuries during the Third Age. Before his transformation, he had been a great king, though whether he hailed from the line of Númenor or from some other mighty people was never recorded. After becoming a wraith, he founded the realm of Angmar in the north, waging war against the Dúnedain kingdoms of Arnor until they were broken and scattered. He wore a crown of steel and commanded with authority second only to Sauron himself among all the Dark Lord's servants. His presence inspired terror. The very sight of him could break the courage of strong warriors, and his voice could command orcs, trolls, and men with equal effectiveness. The second of the Nazgûl to be named was Khamûl, known as the Shadow of the East or the Black Easterling. He had been a king among the Easterling peoples before receiving his ring, and even after his transformation into a wraith, he retained some connection to the eastern lands. Khamûl served as Sauron's lieutenant in various campaigns, and was often tasked with missions requiring particular cunning or endurance. He was the most afraid of daylight among the Nine, preferring to travel and work by night, and he relied heavily on his sense of smell rather than sight to track his prey. In the hunt for the ring in the Third Age, Khamûl led the search through the Shire and pursued the ring-bearer with relentless determination. The Nazgûl rode forth from Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery, which stood in the western mountains at the edge of Mordor. This city had once been Minas Ithil, Tower of the Moon, built by the men of Gondor as a fortress watching the passes. It had been captured by the Nazgûl in the year 2002 of the Third Age after a 2-year siege, and they transformed it into a place of dread. The walls and towers, once white stone, became pale and luminous with a sickly glow, and the air around the city grew cold despite the proximity to Mordor. A bridge crossed the chasm before the main gate, and from the highest tower a corpse light emanated, a signal that could be seen from the plains of Gondor. The city became the dwelling place of the Nine, and from there they issued forth on their fell errands. The transformation of men into Nazgûl was gradual, not instantaneous. When a king first received his ring and began to wear it, the changes were subtle. He would find his life extended, his strength increased, his ability to command and influence others enhanced. But with each passing year, each passing decade, the ring worked deeper into his being. He would begin to feel the call of Sauron's will, gentle at first, like a distant whisper in the back of his mind. His physical form would begin to fade, becoming first translucent, then barely visible, until finally he existed primarily in the shadow world, perceiving the living world as if through a veil. By the time the transformation was complete, nothing remained of the man he had been, only a servant of darkness bound forever to the will of the One Ring. The Nazgûl could not be killed by ordinary means, for they were no longer truly alive. Weapons could wound them, causing them pain and forcing them to retreat, but they would always recover given time and return to continue their appointed tasks. Fire they feared, and water could hinder them. They could not cross running water without difficulty. The greatest weakness they possessed was their dependence on the One Ring. If it were destroyed, they would be unmade, for the power that sustained their unnatural existence would fail. They wore black robes and often went hooded, for their faces, when glimpsed, inspired terror, pale or invisible, with eyes that burned like coals in empty sockets, voices that wailed like the wind over graves. The Nazgûl rode various steeds depending on their purpose. In the Third Age, they often rode black horses, creatures that had been trained or compelled to bear the wraiths, despite the terror their presence inspired in normal animals. These horses were swift and tireless, capable of traveling great distances without rest. But for their most important missions, particularly during the War of the Ring, the Nazgûl rode fell beasts, winged creatures that resembled nothing else in Middle-earth. These beasts were not birds or dragons, but something more ancient and terrible, with vast membranous wings, long naked necks, and beaks filled with teeth. The fell beasts could carry the Nazgûl through the air, giving them speed and reach that no earthly cavalry could match. Shelob, though not a servant of Sauron in any formal sense, nevertheless served his purposes through her simple hunger. She was ancient beyond reckoning, having fled into these mountains in ages past to escape the destruction that befell her ancestor Ungoliant. where Ungoliant had been driven by an insatiable desire to consume all light and all things, Shelob was content with a more limited domain, her tunnels, her pass, and the occasional prey that wandered within reach. She had grown vast over the millennia, her body swollen to enormous size, her legs as thick as tree trunks, her eyes clustered like dark jewels on her head. The venom she produced was not only paralyzing, but also preserved her victims in a state between life and death, allowing her to feed at her leisure. The relationship between Shelob and Sauron was one of mutual convenience rather than alliance. Sauron left her undisturbed because she guarded one of the passes into Mordor more effectively than any army could. She required no payment, no commands, no management. She simply existed in her tunnels and destroyed anyone who attempted to use that road. For her part, Shelob cared nothing for Sauron's plans or his wars. She had existed before he came to Mordor and would continue existing after he fell, for she was eternal in her own way, a remnant of elder days when the world was full of such ancient evils. The orcs who served at Cirith Ungol knew of her and feared her, sometimes offering her captives to ensure she remained sated and did not hunt them. In addition to its fortifications and its armies, Mordor possessed an industrial capacity that allowed it to wage war on a massive scale. Great forges operated day and night, particularly in the region around Orodruin, where the volcanic heat could be harnessed. Here, weapons were made: swords, spears, axes, armor of iron and steel. The metallurgy practiced in Mordor was crude compared to the craft of the elves or the dwarves, but it was effective and efficient, designed to outfit vast armies quickly. The smoke from these forges added to the general pall that hung over Gorgoroth, and the sound of hammers on anvils echoed across the plain. Slaves and orcs labored in these workshops under harsh conditions, producing the material of war in endless quantities. The fields around the Sea of Nurnen were worked by peoples who had been conquered or displaced by Sauron's forces. These were not orcs, but men, some from regions that had resisted Mordor and been defeated, others taken as tribute from vassal kingdoms. They lived in harsh conditions, laboring to grow crops that would feed Sauron's armies. The land around Nurnen, while more fertile than Gorgoroth, was still difficult. The soil was thin in many places, the weather unpredictable, and the ever-present shadow depressed both plants and people. Yet they managed to coax wheat, barley, and other grains from the earth, along with vegetables that could tolerate the poor conditions. These harvests were collected by Sauron's agents and distributed to the military forces, ensuring that the armies of Mordor could campaign for extended periods without worrying about supply lines. The Sea of Nurnen itself was large enough to have its own weather patterns and rhythms. Fishing boats plied its waters, harvesting the fish that thrived in its mineral-rich environment. The fish were not pleasant to taste, carrying a bitter flavor from the water, but they provided necessary protein for the workers and soldiers. Around the shoreline were constructed simple dwellings, storage facilities for grain and equipment, and the inevitable watchtowers where Sauron's overseers kept watch to ensure none escaped and that the quotas of food production were met. The landscape around Nurnen, while grim by the standards of the free peoples, was less actively hostile than Gorgoroth. Here grass grew, albeit stunted and brown, and there was water that, while bitter, could sustain life. The roads of Mordor were extensive and well-maintained, at least by the standards of a military state. The primary road ran from Barad-dûr to the Morannon, a great paved highway wide enough for armies to march 10 abreast. This road was essential for moving troops and supplies between the Dark Tower and the front lines facing Gondor. Secondary roads connected the various fortifications, the forges, the fields around Nurnen, and the passes through the mountains. These roads were not built for comfort, but for functionality. They were direct, efficiently engineered, and designed to move military forces as quickly as possible. Watchtowers lined the major routes at regular intervals, ensuring that any movement could be observed and reported to Barad-dûr. Communication across Mordor's vast territories was maintained through a system of signal fires and messengers. The watchtowers could light beacons that would be visible to the next tower in the chain, allowing messages to be relayed quickly across great distances. For more complex communications, Sauron employed various means including messenger orcs, flying Nazgul, and his own will, which could reach out directly to his most powerful servants across any distance. The Palantir, the seeing stone that Sauron possessed in Barad-dûr, allowed him to observe distant events and communicate with those who possessed other stones, giving him a strategic advantage in coordinating his forces across Middle-earth. Life for the common inhabitants of Mordor was harsh and brutal. Orcs lived in warrens and camps, organized into military units or labor gangs depending on their role. They fought among themselves frequently when not under direct supervision, for they were by nature quarrelsome and violent. Their language was rough and filled with curses, and their culture, such as it was, centered around warfare and survival. They ate whatever was available: spoiled meat, fungus from dark caves, and sometimes each other when food was scarce. They feared Sauron absolutely, and obeyed his commands not from loyalty but from terror of the consequences of disobedience. For men who served in Mordor, whether freely or under compulsion, existence was only marginally better. Those who had come willingly, corrupted by promises of power or wealth, often found themselves disappointed. Sauron was not generous with his servants, and rewards were few. They lived in fortresses or camps, always under the watch of Sauron's agents, knowing that any sign of disloyalty would result in swift and terrible punishment. Those who served unwillingly, the conquered peoples, who worked the fields or labored in the forges, endured conditions of servitude that varied from harsh to unbearable depending on their overseers. They maintained what hope they could, dreaming of liberation that must have seemed impossibly distant. The atmosphere of Mordor was not just physically oppressive, but psychologically crushing. The constant darkness, the knowledge that one lived under the gaze of Sauron's eye, the omnipresent violence and cruelty, all these things wore away at the spirit. Even those who came to Mordor with strong wills and purposes often found themselves ground down over time, their resistance eroded by the relentless bleakness of their surroundings. This was part of Sauron's power. He did not merely command through fear, but shaped the very environment to break the spirits of those within his domain, making them more malleable tools for his purposes. In the year 3018 of the Third Age, as the War of the Ring approached its crisis, events far from Mordor began to impact Sauron's plans. Frodo Baggins, a hobbit of the Shire, carried the One Ring toward Mordor with the desperate intention of destroying it in the fires of Mount Doom. This was a move Sauron had not anticipated. His assumption had always been that whoever possessed the ring would seek to use its power, either to challenge him or to become his ally and eventual rival. The concept that anyone would choose to destroy such power rather than wielding it was alien to his understanding. This blind spot would prove fatal. Frodo's journey into Mordor began at Cirith Ungol, where he and his companion Samwise Gamgee faced the spider Shelob. Through a combination of courage, the light of Arundel's star captured in the Phial of Galadriel, and simple, desperate fighting, they survived the encounter, though Frodo was stung and paralyzed by Shelob's venom. Sam drove the spider off and, believing Frodo dead, took the ring intending to continue the quest alone. But orcs from the Tower of Cirith Ungol found Frodo's body and carried him into their fortress, where Sam later rescued him. The two hobbits, now both inside the borders of Mordor, began the most perilous phase of their journey. Crossing Gorgoroth required stealth, endurance, and remarkable luck. The plain was patrolled by orcs, watched from Barad-dûr, and dangerous in countless ways beyond the military presence. The ground itself was treacherous, full of cracks and sharp rocks that could cut through boot leather. Water was scarce and always fouled. The air was difficult to breathe, thick with ash and sulfurous fumes. Frodo and Sam traveled at night when possible, hiding during the day in whatever shelter they could find. A crevasse, a tumble of rocks, the shadow of an outcrop. The weight of the ring grew heavier with each mile closer to Mount Doom, not in physical weight but in psychological and spiritual burden. Frodo found it increasingly difficult to think clearly, to remember his purpose, to resist the ring's corruption. To move more freely through Mordor, Sam and Frodo disguised themselves in orc gear, taken from bodies at the tower. The armor and clothing were ill-fitting and uncomfortable, made for orcish bodies rather than hobbit frames, but it served its purpose. From a distance, they appeared to be two orcs on some errand, and the disguise allowed them to pass through the edges of military activity without being immediately challenged. They were nearly caught several times, once by a company of orcs marching to war, another time by a slave driver overseeing laborers. Each escape relied on quick thinking, on their small size allowing them to hide where larger beings could not, and on the general chaos and lack of coordination that characterized Mordor's military organization despite its size. The closer they came to Mount Doom, the more the landscape itself seemed to actively resist them. The slopes of Orodruin were covered in loose ash and volcanic stone that shifted underfoot, making each step a struggle. The heat became intense, radiating from the ground and from the glowing vents that released gases from deep within the mountain. The air wavered and shimmered, distorting vision and making it difficult to judge distances. Frodo's strength was nearly exhausted. He had eaten little, drunk less, and carried a burden that was breaking him in body and spirit. Sam supported him, taking as much of Frodo's physical weight as he could, though he could not bear the ring itself. The ring burned against Frodo's skin where it hung on its chain, demanding to be claimed, to be used, promising power even as it enslaved. The path up Orodruin led to the Samath Naur, the Chambers of Fire, where Sauron had forged the ring nearly 5,000 years earlier. This was not a place of easy access. The entrance was a dark opening in the mountainside, leading to a steep ascending passage carved through the volcanic rock. The walls were hot to the touch, and the sound of the mountain's fires grew louder with each step, a roaring that seemed to come from the very roots of the earth. Frodo crawled on hands and knees for the final approach, unable to walk, driven by willpower alone while the ring fought him at every moment, urging him to turn back, to use it, to claim its power for himself. Inside the Samath Naur, the heat was almost unbearable. A great chasm opened in the floor, and far below, barely visible through the gloom and smoke, flowed the molten lava that fed Orodruin's fires. This was the heart of the volcano, the deepest and hottest flames accessible to those who dared to enter. Sauron had stood in this very place and forged the ring in these fires, pouring his power into the gold band while speaking the words that would bind all other rings to it. Now, Frodo stood at the edge of that same chasm, holding the ring that had tormented him for months, ready to complete his quest by casting it into the flames. But at this ultimate moment, the ring's power finally overcame him. He claimed it as his own, placing it on his finger, and in that instant, Sauron knew. The Eye turned its full attention toward Mount Doom, and the Nazgul were dispatched with all speed to prevent the ring's destruction. What happened next was both tragic and fortunate. Gollum, the creature who had possessed the ring for centuries before losing it to Bilbo Baggins, had followed Frodo and Sam through all their journey. He had attacked Frodo there in the Samath Naur, desperate to reclaim what he called his precious. In the struggle, Gollum bit off Frodo's finger, ring and all, and in his moment of triumph, dancing with joy while clutching his recovered treasure, he lost his balance and fell into the chasm. The ring, still on the severed finger in Gollum's hand, plunged into the lava. The destruction was instantaneous. The gold melted, the binding broke, and the spell that Sauron had woven into the ring unraveled. A great cry went up from Barad-dûr as Sauron realized what had happened, and then the tower fell. The collapse of Barad-dûr was catastrophic and complete. The foundations, bound with the power of the ring, simply failed. The entire structure, every tower and wall and dungeon that had stood for 5,000 years, came crashing down in a cloud of dust and debris that could be seen for 100 miles. The noise of its falling was like thunder that rolled on, and the ground shook as if in an earthquake. With Barad-dûr's destruction came the dissolution of much of Sauron's other works. The Morannon collapsed, the fortifications crumbled, and across Gorgoroth, the orcs and other servants fled in terror and confusion. The Eye, the manifestation of Sauron's will that had watched over all, was extinguished. Sauron himself, having placed so much of his essence into the ring, was not destroyed entirely, but was reduced to a powerless spirit, unable ever again to take physical form or influence the world. Mount Doom itself erupted in response to the ring's destruction. Rivers of lava poured down its slopes, the volcano vomiting forth fire and ash in a cataclysmic display. The ground split in great fissures, and the heat became so intense that nothing could survive near the mountain. Frodo and Sam, having completed their impossible quest, were trapped on the mountainside with no path of escape. They reconciled themselves to death, finding what comfort they could in each other's company and in the knowledge that they had succeeded. But they were not abandoned. Gandalf, who had coordinated the armies of the West in their desperate diversionary attack on the Morannon, sent the Great Eagles to rescue them. Gwaihir, Lord of the Eagles, plucked them from the destruction and bore them to safety. In the aftermath of Sauron's fall, the peoples who had labored under his dominion in the fields around Núrnen found themselves suddenly free. With no overseers to enforce servitude, with the watchtowers emptied, and the military apparatus collapsed, they simply stopped working and began to make their way out of Mordor. King Elisar, formerly known as Aragorn, who had led the armies of the West and now claimed the throne of Gondor, issued a decree regarding these people. He freed them officially from all bondage and gave them the lands around Núrnen as their own, to hold and to govern themselves. This act of mercy and justice meant that Mordor, while still shadowed by its history, now contained at least one region where people lived in freedom. The orcs who had served Sauron fled in all directions after his fall. Some went into the mountains, hiding in deep caverns and remote valleys where they attempted to continue their existence away from the eyes of men and elves. Others were hunted down by the victorious armies or by peoples they had oppressed during Sauron's reign. A few may have attempted to integrate themselves into remote regions where questions were not asked, but their nature made peaceful coexistence difficult. The great concentrations of orcs that had existed in Mordor and in other strongholds were broken apart, and while orcs would continue to exist in Middle-earth, they would never again be gathered in such numbers or organized so effectively. The Nazgul, being bound to the ring and dependent on its power for their continued existence, were unmade when it was destroyed. At the moment of the ring's dissolution, they simply ceased to be, not killed in the conventional sense, but rather unbound, released from the spell that had kept them in their undead state. Whatever remained of the men they had once been, if anything, was freed in that instant. Though after so many centuries of servitude and corruption, it is difficult to imagine what, if anything, could have survived of their original selves. Their fell steeds, being mortal creatures despite their terrible nature, likely died with their riders, or fled to some distant place where they might have lived out their remaining days. The question of what became of Mordor in the long term, in the Fourth Age and beyond, was never fully answered in the histories that survived. The land itself remained. The mountains did not crumble, Horadruin continued to smolder, and Gorgoroth was still a wasteland of volcanic rock and ash. But without Sauron's influence, without the constant industrial activity and military presence, nature began slowly to reclaim what it could. Rain fell more frequently with the shadow lifted. Plants, hardy species adapted to harsh conditions, began to grow in the less hostile areas. The fields around Nornen, now tended by free people rather than slaves, might have become more productive with time and better care. Barad-dûr was never rebuilt. The ruins stood as a memorial to the Second and Third Ages, a reminder of the darkness that had once ruled there. Travelers and historians might visit the site in later ages, walking among the fallen stones and trying to imagine the terrible majesty of the tower that once stood there. The ruins would have been impressive even in their broken state. Fragments of walls standing several stories high, massive foundation stones still locked together despite the failure of the binding that had held them, dark chambers descending into the earth where the dungeons had been. But no one would attempt to restore or inhabit such a place, for the memory of what it represented was too dark, and the stones themselves seemed poisoned by the evil that had been worked there. The language that Sauron had created, the Black Speech, fell into disuse after his defeat. This tongue had never been widely adopted even in Mordor. Orcs preferred their own corrupt dialects, and men serving Sauron often used common speech or their native languages. The Black Speech had been Sauron's attempt to create a language that would unite his servants and express his will, but it was harsh and unpleasant to speak, full of guttural sounds and lacking the subtlety for anything beyond commands and curses. With Sauron gone, there was no one to enforce its use, and it was gradually forgotten except by scholars who studied the histories of the Third Age and needed to understand the inscription on the ring. The memory of Mordor lived on in the legends and histories of the free peoples. Parents would tell their children of the great darkness in the east, of the armies that had marched from those shadowed lands, of the heroes who had stood against them and ultimately prevailed. The name Mordor became synonymous with evil, tyranny, and the corruption of power. But it was also a reminder that even the greatest evils could be overcome, that even the smallest and seemingly weakest could accomplish great deeds if they had courage and did not lose hope. The story of Frodo and Sam, two hobbits from the peaceful Shire who walked into Mordor and destroyed the One Ring, became one of the central tales of that age. For those who had lived through the War of the Ring, Mordor held personal memories of friends lost, of terror endured, of the desperate hope that they might see another dawn. Veterans of the battles at the Morannon or Pelennor fields would sometimes speak of what they had seen and felt, of the shadow that had seemed to cover all the world, of the moment when it lifted and they realized they had survived. These stories passed from generation to generation, each retelling adding new details or losing old ones, but the essential truth remained, that there had been a great darkness, and it had been defeated through sacrifice and courage. In the scholarly traditions of Gondor, the history of Mordor was carefully recorded and studied. The libraries in Minas Tirith, the rebuilt capital of the reunited kingdom, contained detailed accounts compiled from multiple sources. Eyewitness testimonies from those who had entered Mordor, recovered documents from Sauron's archives, interviews with those who had served him under compulsion and survived. These histories were not meant to glorify war or to dwell unnecessarily on darkness, but to preserve accurate knowledge so that future generations might understand what had happened and learn from it. The mistakes that had led to Sauron's rise, the forging of the Rings of Power, the fall of Numenor, the long sleep of Gondor while evil grew unchecked, were analyzed so that they might not be repeated. The elves, many of whom departed Middle-earth for the Undying Lands after the War of the Ring, carried with them their own memories of Mordor and of Sauron. For the elves, Sauron had been a figure of terror and corruption for entire ages of the world. They remembered the first age when he had served Morgoth, the second age when he had deceived them in the guise of Anatar, and the third age when he had waged war against all the free peoples. Their songs and histories preserved knowledge of his nature and his deeds with a clarity that mortal memory could not match, for elves did not forget as men did. When they sailed west, they took these memories with them, ensuring that in the Blessed Realm, the full truth of what had transpired in Middle-earth would be preserved. The dwarves, who had their own long and often bitter history with Sauron's servants, maintained their own records of the wars and the part they had played. While dwarves had not been as directly affected by Mordor as men and elves, their kingdoms were in the mountains, often far from Sauron's immediate influence. They had fought against orcs for millennia, and many dwarf warriors had marched to the Battle of the Morannon as part of the host of the West. In their deep halls, carved in stone, were memorials to those who had fallen, and in their songs were remembered the great deeds and terrible losses of that age. The Shire, home of the hobbits, was perhaps the place that changed least in response to the War of the Ring. Most hobbits had little interest in the great events of the wider world, preferring the comfortable rhythms of their daily lives, planting and harvesting, brewing and smoking, eating and celebrating. Yet, even there, the story of Frodo and his companions became part of the local lore. The Red Book of Westmarch, which contained Bilbo's account of his adventure and Frodo's account of the War of the Ring, was preserved and copied, becoming one of the primary sources for later historians studying that period. The hobbits who had seen Mordor with their own eyes, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, carried those memories for the rest of their lives, forever marked by experiences that set them apart from their fellows. Geography was not all that defined Mordor. There was also a quality to the light, or rather to the absence of light, that affected all who dwelt there. The perpetual cloud cover and volcanic ash in the atmosphere filtered and scattered sunlight, creating a world where true daylight never penetrated. Everything was seen through a veil of gray and brown, colors muted and shadows deep. This lighting affected more than just visibility. It influenced mood, sapped energy, and contributed to the general atmosphere of oppression. Plants that did manage to grow in the less hostile regions were pale and stunted, their leaves struggling to capture enough light for photosynthesis. The psychological effect on the inhabitants was significant, contributing to the general bleakness of existence within those borders. The water sources in Mordor were limited and often contaminated. Aside from the Sea of Nurnen, there were few permanent rivers or lakes. The streams that did exist often carried runoff from volcanic regions, making the water bitter with dissolved minerals or outright poisonous with sulfur compounds. Anyone traveling through Mordor had to carry water with them, or know where the rare clean sources could be found. This scarcity of clean water was both a natural consequence of the volcanic geology and a strategic advantage for Sauron. Invading armies would struggle to find sufficient water to sustain their forces, while defenders who knew the location of springs and wells could maintain themselves more easily. The wildlife of Mordor, such as it was, consisted largely of creatures adapted to harsh conditions. Carrion birds circled above the plains, feeding on the bodies of those who perished there. Rat and other scavengers lived in the ruins and settlements, thriving on refuse and waste. Snakes and scorpions hid among the rocks, venomous and dangerous to any who disturbed them. There were said to be other, stranger creatures in the more remote regions, things that had lived in those mountains since ancient times, predating even Sauron's arrival. These creatures were rarely seen, but contributed to the sense that Mordor was a land where the natural order had been corrupted or replaced by something more primal and hostile. The smell of Mordor was distinctive and unpleasant, a mixture of sulfur from volcanic vents, smoke from the forges, and from Mount Doom. The stench of too many bodies living in close quarters without proper sanitation, and the underlying odor of decay that pervaded everything. Those who entered Mordor from outside found the smell almost overwhelming at first, though eventually one could grow somewhat accustomed to it. The smell clung to clothing and hair, persisting even after leaving the region, serving as a physical reminder of time spent in that dark land. The sound of Mordor was equally oppressive. The constant low rumble of Mount Doom, the clank and roar of the forges, the shouts and curses of orcs, the tramp of marching feet, the occasional scream from the dungeons of Barad-dûr. Even in the quieter areas around Nurnen, the wind carried these sounds from Gorgoroth, ensuring that nowhere within Mordor's borders was truly peaceful. At night, the sounds often became worse. Orcs were more active after dark, and the noises of violence and cruelty echoed across the plains. The concept of seasons had little meaning in Mordor. The volcanic activity and the constant shadow meant that temperature variations were more related to proximity to Orodruin or to particular weather patterns than to the time of year. The fields around Nurnen experienced something like seasons. There were times when rain was more common and times when it was less, times when the temperature was relatively cooler and times when it was warmer. But in Gorgoroth, every day was much like every other day. Gray, hot during daylight hours, cold at night, with the ever-present smoke and ash making the sky indistinguishable from one month to the next. The architecture of Mordor, what little of it existed beyond fortifications, was brutally functional. Buildings were constructed from stone, with little attention to aesthetics or comfort. Structures were designed to be defensible, to provide shelter from the elements, and to efficiently house the maximum number of inhabitants with minimal space. There was no ornamentation, no art for its own sake. Everything served a purpose, usually military or industrial. Even Barad-dûr, for all its immense scale and terrible majesty, was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was impressive, overwhelming, designed to inspire fear and awe, but not to please the eye or lift the spirit. The night sky over Mordor, on the rare occasions when the clouds parted enough to see it, displayed the same stars visible elsewhere in Middle-earth. But they seemed dimmer, their light struggling to penetrate the atmospheric murk, and their familiar patterns were often obscured by drifting ash and smoke. The moon, when visible, appeared reddish or gray, its light insufficient to provide real illumination. For those who knew the stars and used them for navigation or for comfort, their absence or obscurity in Mordor's sky was yet another reminder of how removed this place was from the normal world. The legacy of Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, was present throughout Mordor, even though he had been cast into the void at the end of the First Age. Sauron had been Morgoth's greatest servant, and much of what he built in Mordor was inspired by or copied from his old master's works. The use of orcs, the reliance on fortifications and overwhelming force, the corruption of natural creatures and places. All these were techniques Morgoth had pioneered. In some sense, Mordor was Morgoth's final revenge on Middle-earth, a poisoned legacy that outlasted his physical presence by thousands of years. The psychology of power and domination that Sauron embodied was central to understanding Mordor. This was not a realm built on any positive principle, not on justice or prosperity or the common good. It was built entirely on the concept of power, the power to command, to coerce, to destroy. Every structure, every policy, every action taken in Mordor served the purpose of maintaining and extending that power. This made it brittle in certain ways, for power without any deeper foundation becomes entirely dependent on the perception of that power. When Sauron fell and his power was broken, the entire structure collapsed because there was nothing else holding it together. No loyalty, no shared purpose, no mutual benefit, only fear. And when the source of that fear was removed, there was nothing left. The fate of individual inhabitants of Mordor after Sauron's fall varied widely. Some, particularly among the orcs, likely perished in the immediate aftermath, killed by collapsing structures, by the eruption of Mount Doom, by conflicts with each other once the chain of command broke down, or by the vengeful forces of the victorious alliance. Others managed to escape and find some kind of existence elsewhere, though what kind of life an orc could build in a world where they were universally hated and hunted is difficult to imagine. The men who had served Sauron faced different fates. Some were killed in the last battles, others were judged by the victors with varying degrees of mercy or severity depending on their crimes, and still others simply disappeared into the vastness of Middle-earth, perhaps attempting to start new lives where their past was unknown. The strategic importance of Mordor had been primarily its defensibility and its isolation. Surrounded by mountains with only a few guarded passes, it could be held against vastly superior numbers. An army attempting to invade Mordor faced tremendous challenges. getting through the passes under fire from the fortifications, surviving in the hostile environment once inside, and then having to assault Barad-dûr itself. This had been demonstrated during the last alliance when the siege of Barad-dûr took 7 years, and would have taken longer except that Sauron finally came forth to give battle. The same geographical features that made Mordor defensible also made it somewhat isolated, requiring supply lines through difficult terrain. But for Sauron, who could sustain his armies through the fields of Núrnin, and who had no concern for the comfort of his troops, this was an acceptable trade-off. The symbolic weight that Mordor carried in the minds of Middle-earth's peoples was perhaps as important as its physical reality. It represented the place where evil dwelt, the shadow in the east, the source of the armies and creatures that plagued the free peoples. This symbolic importance meant that the mere existence of Mordor, even during periods when Sauron was not actively waging war, cast a shadow over the neighboring realms. Gondor, in particular, spent much of the Third Age maintaining a watch on Mordor, manning fortresses and garrisons in anticipation of the day when Sauron would return and march forth again. The psychological burden of knowing that such a threat existed, even if dormant, affected the policies and culture of these neighboring lands. The relationship between Mordor and the land of Gondor was particularly significant. For these, two realms were eternal adversaries, locked in a struggle that lasted for most of the Third Age. Gondor had been founded by exiles from Númenor in the Second Age, and it had been one of the primary forces in the last alliance that defeated Sauron at the end of that age. During the Third Age, after Sauron slowly regained strength and returned to Mordor, Gondor found itself as the primary bulwark against his expansion westward. The strategic geography placed Gondor directly in Mordor's path to the rich lands of the west, and over the centuries, this resulted in numerous wars, raids, and constant vigilance. The Haradrim, men from the lands far to the south, served in Sauron's armies not because they were inherently evil, but due to a complex mix of ancient grievances, domination, and corruption. Their lands had been influenced by Sauron's emissaries for generations, and many among them had been brought to serve his cause through promises of revenge against Gondor, or through threats and displays of power. The Haradrim, who marched to war, brought their own culture and traditions. They rode the great Oliphants, massive beasts trained for war, and they bore curved swords and fought with tactics developed in the deserts and savannas of their homeland. After Sauron's fall, the relationship between Gondor and Harad would need to be rebuilt, a process that would take generations. The impact of Mordor on the environment of the surrounding regions was significant. The ash that Mount Doom spewed into the atmosphere did not stay confined within Mordor's borders. It drifted on the winds, sometimes falling as dark rain or dust across Gondor and even into Rohan and beyond. This ash could damage crops, foul water sources, and create respiratory problems for people and animals who breathed it in concentration. The psychological impact of seeing the dark clouds from Mount Doom on the horizon was also considerable, a constant reminder of the threat that lurked in the east. After Sauron's defeat and the cessation of industrial activities in Mordor, the air quality in the surrounding regions would have gradually improved as the sources of pollution were eliminated. The question of whether Mordor could ever be redeemed, whether the land itself could be healed and made fair again, was one without a clear answer. The geographical features that made it hostile, the mountains, the volcanic activity, the lack of water, were permanent aspects of the landscape and would not change regardless of who controlled the region. but the corruption that Sauron had worked into the very stones and soil might fade over time. Given centuries or millennia without the presence of evil working actively to maintain that corruption, given the slow work of plants and weather and time, perhaps Mordor could become, if not beautiful, at least less oppressive. The people living around Núrnan would be the first to know if such healing occurred, for they would work the land and see whether it responded to care and cultivation. The story of Mordor is ultimately a story about power, its uses and abuses, its attractions and its costs. Sauron built an entire realm based on domination, creating a system where every inhabitant existed solely to serve his will. This granted him tremendous military and industrial capacity, allowing him to field armies that outnumbered his enemies and to wage war for centuries without exhausting his resources. But this system also contained the seeds of its own destruction. Power based purely on force and fear has no resilience. When the source of that power fails, when the fear is removed, the entire structure collapses instantly. In contrast, the free peoples, with all their divisions and weakness, possessed something that Mordor lacked. They fought not because they were forced to, but because they chose to, defending things they loved rather than serving a master they feared. The final lesson of Mordor might be found in its very emptiness after Sauron's fall. Without him, it became simply a geographical location, neither more nor less hostile than its natural features dictated. The darkness that had hung over it was not intrinsic to the land, but was a product of the will that had dwelt there. This suggests that places are, in the end, shaped by those who inhabit them, that evil is not located in stones or soil, but in choices and actions. Mordor was terrible because Sauron made it so, maintaining through constant effort the atmosphere of dread and oppression. When that effort ceased, when that will was broken, the land remained, but the darkness began to fade, leaving behind ruins and memories, cautionary tales for future ages, and the slow possibility of renewal. The construction of the Morannon, the Black Gate, was a project that took decades to complete during the Second Age. The gate was designed not merely to close a pass, but to make it absolutely impassable when shut. Two towers stood on either side, Carchost and Narchost, known together as the Towers of the Teeth. These towers were built into the mountainsides themselves, their foundations carved from the living rock of the Irid Lithui. Each tower was tall enough to provide a commanding view of the approaches from the west, and between them stretched the actual gates, massive valves of iron and steel, each so heavy that it required complex mechanisms of chains and counterweights to move them. When the gates stood open, armies could march through 10 or 20 abreast, but when they closed, they formed a barrier that no ram could break and no siege engine could overcome. The Towers of the Teeth served multiple purposes beyond simply guarding the gate. They housed garrisons of soldiers, both orcs and men, who could respond to any threat. They contained stores of weapons and food sufficient to withstand a long siege. Most importantly, they served as watchtowers, their heights allowing observers to see far across the plains of Dagorlad to the west, providing early warning of any approaching force. Signal fires on these towers could communicate with other fortifications throughout Mordor, creating a network of information that flowed back to Barad-dûr. The towers also projected Sauron's power psychologically. They were a statement that this land was claimed, defended, and would not be surrendered. The plains of Dagorlad, which lay before the Morannon, had been the site of the greatest battle of the Second Age. In the year 3434 of that age, the last alliance of elves and men met the forces of Sauron in a battle that lasted for months. The field had been chosen by necessity. It was the only approach to the Morannon that could accommodate the vast armies involved, and Sauron's forces had marched out to meet the alliance rather than waiting to be besieged. The battle was fought with desperate intensity, for both sides understood that the fate of Middle-earth hung in the balance. The alliance, though suffering terrible losses, eventually drove Sauron's armies back through the Morannon and began the siege of Barad-dûr itself. The Dead Marshes, which lay to the northwest of the Morannon, were created by the Battle of Dagorlad. So many died on that field, elves, men, orcs, and other creatures, that the ground could not fully absorb them. Over the years that followed, the area became waterlogged, turning into a vast marshland. The bodies of the fallen were gradually covered by water and preserved in the anaerobic conditions of the marsh. In later ages, travelers through the Dead Marshes reported seeing faces beneath the water, the preserved bodies of warriors from that ancient battle, still recognizable after thousands of years. Lights would sometimes appear at night, pale flames that drifted across the marsh. Corpse candles, some called them, though their true nature was unknown. The marshes were dangerous to cross, for the solid ground was scarce and difficult to identify, and many who attempted the passage were lost. The siege of Barad-dûr that followed the Battle of Dagorlad lasted 7 years, from 3434 to 3441 of the Second Age. The Alliance established camps around the Dark Tower, cutting it off from resupply and preventing any forces from entering or leaving. But Barad-dûr was provisioned for a long siege. Its storerooms were vast, and the fortress had its own water sources. The besiegers suffered as much as the besieged in some ways, for the climate of Gorgoroth was hostile, and maintaining an army in such conditions for years was a tremendous challenge. Supplies had to be brought from great distances, through the passes and across Dagorlad, a logistical nightmare that required constant effort. Yet the Alliance held firm, maintained by the determination of their leaders and the knowledge that failure would mean the domination of all Middle-earth by Sauron. Finally, in the 7th year of the siege, Sauron himself came forth to give battle. The reasons for this decision have been debated by historians. Perhaps he believed he could break the siege through direct confrontation. Perhaps he grew weary of confinement, or perhaps he simply recognized that the siege could not be maintained indefinitely and chose to force a resolution. He came forth with his remaining forces, and a final battle was fought on the slopes of Mount Doom. Gil-galad, High King of the Elves, and Elendil, High King of Arnor and Gondor, confronted Sauron directly. All three were cast down. Gil-galad was slain by the heat of Sauron's hand, and Elendil fell beneath the Dark Lord's mace. But Isildur, son of Elendil, took up the shard of his father's broken sword Narsil and cut the ring from Sauron's hand. With the ring separated from him, Sauron's physical form was destroyed, and his spirit fled into the shadows, too weakened to maintain form. Isildur's decision not to destroy the ring at that moment, when he stood at the very edge of the Samath Naur with the ring in his possession, has been called the greatest tragedy of the age. Elrond and Círdan, who were present, counseled him to cast it into the fire, to end Sauron's power permanently. But Isildur, whether from weariness, from the ring's corrupting influence, or from a desire to keep it as weregild for his father's death, refused. He claimed the ring as his own and departed from Mordor. This decision would have consequences that lasted for thousands of years, for though Sauron was defeated, he was not destroyed, and the ring remained in Middle-earth, waiting to be found and to call its master back from the shadows. After the victory of the last alliance, Mordor was largely abandoned. The fortifications were left standing but unmanned. The alliance had suffered too greatly to garrison the region, and there seemed little point in doing so with Sauron defeated. The Morannon stood open, and the Tower of Cirith Ungol was empty of all but Shelob. Barad-dûr remained intact, its foundations still bound by the power of the ring, but no armies marched from its gates, and no light burned in its tower. For 1,000 years of the Third Age, Mordor was a haunted wasteland, avoided by all but the most desperate or foolhardy. Orcs and other creatures still lurked in the mountains and caves, but they were disorganized and posed no threat to the surrounding lands. The watch on Mordor during these early centuries of the Third Age was maintained by Gondor through a series of fortresses built along the borders. The greatest of these was Minas Ithil, Tower of the Moon, built in the pass between Mordor and Gondor. This fortress city was founded by Isildur before his death, intended as a permanent guard against the possibility of Sauron's return. For many centuries, Minas Ithil stood as a symbol of vigilance, its white walls gleaming in the moonlight, its garrison ever watchful. But maintaining such vigilance over generations, over centuries, is difficult when no threat materializes. Gradually, as the peace stretched on and memory of the wars faded, the watchfulness lessened. Around the year 1000 of the Third Age, Sauron's spirit, which had been hiding in the wastes, began to take form again. He did not return immediately to Mordor, for that would have been too obvious and would have drawn immediate response from the free peoples. Instead, he established himself in Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery, in Mirkwood, far to the north. Here he worked in secret, calling the Nazgul back to his service and slowly gathering his strength. The wise, including Gandalf and the great elves, suspected that some dark power had arisen in Mirkwood, but did not at first realize it was Sauron himself. By the time they confirmed his identity, he had grown strong enough that driving him out required a great effort. In 2951 of the Third Age, Sauron openly declared himself and returned to Mordor. He began rebuilding Barad-dûr, which still stood in its foundations but needed reconstruction in its upper levels. The Nazgul claimed Minas Ithil after a 2-year siege, transforming it into Minas Morgul, and from there they kept watch on Gondor. Sauron also sent emissaries to the east and south, calling to his service the peoples who dwelt there, or compelling them through displays of power. Orc populations that had been scattered and hiding began to gather again, answering the summons of their master. Within a few decades, Mordor was once again a thriving realm of darkness, preparing for war. The mouth of Sauron, who appeared as an emissary to the host of the West at the Black Gate in the final days of the War of the Ring, was a figure of particular interest. He was described as a man, tall and evil, who wore a tall helm with a blank face. He had been among the Black Númenóreans who served Sauron, and he had done so for so long that he had forgotten his own name. He was known only by his title as Sauron's messenger and spokesman. His role was to conduct negotiations, to deliver threats, and to manage communications with those outside Mordor. The fact that he had lived for so long suggested that Sauron had extended his life through sorcery, for no natural span could have covered the centuries of his service. When he came forth to parley with the host of the West, he brought tokens taken from Frodo, clothing and armor, attempting to break their will by suggesting that their plan had failed and the ring-bearer was captured. The concept of time within Mordor was distorted by the constant darkness and the unchanging conditions. Days passed without clear sunrise or sunset, marked only by a slight lessening or deepening of the gloom. For those who lived there, this could create a sense of timelessness, a feeling that one day was indistinguishable from another, that the present moment stretched endlessly without clear beginning or end. This temporal distortion was psychologically wearing. Humans and even orcs need some sense of rhythm and progression to maintain mental health, and the absence of clear day-night cycles contributed to the general oppressiveness of existence in Mordor. Some inhabitants marked time by shifts of labor or watches, artificial divisions imposed to create structure where natural structure was absent. The flora that managed to survive in Mordor's hostile environment was limited and adapted to extreme conditions. Around Nurnen, hardy grasses grew, tough and fibrous, not particularly nutritious but capable of surviving the poor soil and erratic water. There may have been some stunted trees in the most sheltered areas, twisted by the conditions into shapes that bore little resemblance to their counterparts in more hospitable lands. Lichens and mosses could be found on rocks in areas where moisture accumulated, and certain types of fungus thrived in dark caves and tunnels. These organisms, while not impressive, represented life's stubborn persistence even in the most adverse circumstances. They also provided food for the smallest creatures, insects, snails, and other invertebrates that formed the bottom of Mordor's minimal food chain. The smithies and forges of Mordor produced weapons and armor in vast quantities, but the quality varied considerably. The best work was reserved for the Nazgul, for elite units, and for Sauron's personal armory. These pieces were well crafted, made from good steel, properly tempered and sharpened. But the majority of arms produced were adequate at best. Swords that would break if struck against good armor, mail that would tear under determined assault, helmets that provided minimal protection. The priority was quantity over quality, for Sauron's strategy relied on overwhelming numbers rather than superior equipment. An orc equipped with mediocre gear was still a dangerous opponent for an untrained civilian, and against trained soldiers, sufficient numbers could still prevail despite inferior armament. The knowledge preserved in Mordor included lore that had been lost or forbidden elsewhere. Sauron had lived through multiple ages of the world and had been a Maya, a lesser divine being, before his fall. He possessed knowledge of craft, of languages, of the deep structure of the world that few others could match. Some of this knowledge he shared with his most trusted servants, the Nazgul, the mouth of Sauron, certain sorcerers among men and orcs who showed aptitude. This lore included the making of certain weapons and devices, the art of breeding and shaping creatures to his purposes, and various forms of sorcery. However, Sauron was not generous with this knowledge. He shared only what was necessary to accomplish his goals, and always maintained a hierarchy where he alone possessed the deepest secrets. This ensured that his servants remained dependent on him and could not easily replace him should he fall. The breeding programs Sauron conducted over thousands of years produced variations in orcs, trolls, and other creatures. This was not rapid genetic engineering, but rather selective breeding over many generations, choosing for traits that served his purposes: size, strength, aggression, ability to tolerate sunlight, intelligence sufficient to follow complex orders but not sufficient to question authority. The process was cruel, for it involved not just selection but also harsh treatment designed to weed out weakness and enforce obedience. Failed experiments, Creatures that didn't meet requirements or that proved too unstable were discarded or used as fodder in ways that served other purposes. The result was a diverse population of creatures, each type suited to particular roles in Sauron's armies or in the functioning of his realm. The communication systems within Mordor relied on multiple methods depending on the urgency and nature of the message. For routine communications, messengers traveled the roads, orcs or men on foot or mounted, carrying sealed orders or verbal messages. For urgent communications, the signal fires could be lit, relaying simple messages quickly across great distances. Enemy approaching, reinforcements needed, or similar basic alerts. Sauron himself could communicate directly with the Nazgul and with other powerful servants through will alone, projecting his thoughts across distance without need for physical messenger. The Palantir, the Seeing Stone, allowed him to observe distant locations and to communicate with anyone else who possessed one of the stones, though by the Third Age, most of the Palantiri were lost, or in hands he did not control. The dungeons of Barad-dûr descended deep into the earth, carved from the volcanic rock beneath the tower. These were places of interrogation and confinement, where prisoners were held and questioned. The conditions were deliberately terrible, cells that were too small to stand in or lie down comfortably, absolute darkness, extremes of heat or cold, constant noise or absolute silence depending on what would be most psychologically damaging. Prisoners were given just enough food and water to keep them alive, for a dead prisoner could provide no information and served no purpose. The interrogators were skilled in their grim craft, knowing how to apply pressure without killing, how to break a will without destroying the mind entirely, for a broken mind could not answer questions coherently. Many who entered those dungeons never emerged, and those who did were forever changed by the experience. The records kept in Barad-dûr were extensive, for Sauron was methodical in his governance despite its cruelty. Lists of troops and their assignments, inventories of weapons and supplies, maps and strategic plans, records of tribute from vassal states, genealogies of useful bloodlines, and reports from spies and scouts throughout Middle-earth. All these and more were maintained by scribes working in the depths of the tower. These records were written in the common speech, in the black speech, and in various other languages depending on their origin and purpose. The script used was often angular and harsh, reflecting the nature of the realm that produced it. When Barad-dûr fell, most of these records were destroyed in the collapse or were seized by the victors and removed to the libraries of Minas Tirith for study. The relationship between Sauron and his orc servants was complex. Orcs feared him absolutely and obeyed his commands without question when under direct supervision. But they also hated him and would have rebelled if they believed it possible to succeed. They were kept in line through a combination of fear, force, and the absence of any alternative. Orcs were not welcome in the lands of men or elves, where they would be killed on sight. They had no homeland they could retreat to, no society they could build independently. Sauron provided them with purpose, organization, and a place in a structure, however brutal that structure might be. When he fell and that structure collapsed, the orcs were left without direction, and they scattered because they had no framework for acting collectively without external compulsion. The concept of loyalty in Mordor was fundamentally different from loyalty in the Free People's realms. In Gondor, or Rohan, loyalty was earned through shared values, through bonds of kinship or friendship, through respect for just authority. In Mordor, loyalty was maintained through fear and through the absence of alternatives. A servant was loyal not because he believed in Sauron's cause or respected him as a leader, but because betrayal would result in immediate and terrible punishment, and because there was nowhere to flee that would offer safety or better conditions. This created a realm that was powerful but brittle, capable of tremendous organized violence, but incapable of adapting to unexpected circumstances or of continuing to function when the central authority was removed. The economy of Mordor, such as it was, functioned on principles of command and extraction, rather than trade and mutual benefit. There was no currency, no markets where goods were bought and sold. Instead, production was directed from above. Forge this many swords, grow this much grain, mine this much ore, and the products were distributed according to Sauron's priorities. Those who labored received minimal sustenance sufficient to keep them working. There was no accumulation of wealth among the common inhabitants, no possibility of improving one's circumstances through work or innovation. The economy existed solely to support military objectives, and efficiency was measured not in prosperity or happiness, but in the number of soldiers that could be equipped and fed. The few visitors who entered Mordor voluntarily during Sauron's reign were spies, emissaries from peoples considering alliance with him, or individuals seeking power who believed they could gain it in his service. These visitors were always watched carefully, never fully trusted, and often found that entering Mordor was easier than leaving it. Sauron was paranoid about information leaving his realm. What he allowed others to see was carefully controlled, and those who saw too much often did not survive to report it. Emissaries who came to negotiate might be received with a show of power designed to intimidate, then sent away with threats or promises depending on Sauron's assessment of their usefulness. Spies, if discovered, faced the dungeons and whatever information could be extracted from them before they died. The weather patterns in Mordor, while generally consistent in their oppressiveness, did vary to some degree. Occasionally, strong winds would blow from the west or south, temporarily clearing some of the ash and smoke from the air. During these periods, the sky might briefly become visible, showing blue or stars depending on the time of day. These moments of clarity were brief but psychologically significant for those who experienced them, a reminder that beyond Mordor's borders, the world was different, that the sun still shone and the air was clean. But such moments never lasted long. The volcanic activity would continue. New smoke would rise and the familiar gray pall would settle back over the land. The training of orc armies was continuous and harsh. Young orcs were raised in a culture of violence, learning to fight almost as soon as they could walk. Training emphasized aggression, basic tactical skills, and absolute obedience to authority. Discipline was maintained through brutal punishments, beatings, starvation, or death for those who failed to meet standards or who showed signs of disobedience. Orcish military doctrine favored mass assaults, overwhelming enemy positions through sheer numbers and ferocity rather than through complex tactics. They were taught to fight in formations when necessary, but were often more effective as raiders, using their natural cruelty and lack of restraint to terrorize opponents. The best orc warriors were those who combined natural ferocity with enough discipline to follow orders and coordinate with others. The various tribes and groups within Mordor's orc population maintained distinct identities despite their service to a common master. There were orcs who traced their lineage to the tribes that had served Sauron in the Second Age, and there were more recent arrivals from the mountains of the Misty Mountains, or from other regions. These groups often feuded among themselves, when not actively engaged in external campaigns, fighting over status, resources, or old grievances. Sauron generally allowed this infighting to continue as long as it didn't interfere with his plans, perhaps believing that it kept the orcs from uniting against him, or simply not caring about conflicts among lesser beings as long as they served their purpose when called upon. The water supply for Barad-dûr came from deep wells drilled into the rock, tapping into underground aquifers. The water was warm from the geothermal heat below and often had a mineral taste, but it was drinkable and, more importantly, it was secure. An enemy could not poison or cut off the supply without first taking the fortress. The wells were maintained by slaves who worked in the deep places of the tower, laboring in heat and darkness to ensure the mechanisms continued functioning. Similar wells existed in other major fortifications throughout Mordor, for water security was essential in a land where surface water was scarce and often contaminated. The phenomenon of the Eye of Sauron, as described by those who witnessed it, was both literal and metaphorical. There was indeed a great lidless eye, burning like a fire, that could be seen atop Barad-dûr. Whether this was Sauron's actual form, a manifestation of his will, or some construct he had created, was debated by scholars. But the eye also represented his awareness and attention. He could not literally see all of Middle-earth simultaneously, despite the impression of omniscience he cultivated. His attention was powerful but focused, and he could only truly perceive one place or situation at a time in full detail. The ring on Frodo's finger, when Frodo claimed it in the Sammath Naur, drew the eye's full attention like a beacon, causing Sauron to focus entirely on Mount Doom and neglect the siege at his gates, a distraction that proved fatal when the ring was destroyed before he could respond effectively. The process by which Sauron selected individuals for positions of authority within his hierarchy was based on demonstrated capability, useful knowledge, and proven loyalty through long service. He showed no favoritism based on species. Orcs, men, and other creatures were evaluated solely on what they could contribute to his goals. The Nazgûl held the highest positions by virtue of their power and their absolute binding to his will through the rings they had accepted. Below them were various lieutenants, the Mouth of Sauron, commanders of orc armies, sorcerers who managed various arcane projects, and administrators who oversaw economic production. Advancement was possible but required both competence and survival, for Sauron did not tolerate failure and was quick to discard tools that no longer served their purpose. The propaganda within Mordor emphasized Sauron's power, inevitability of his victory, and the futility of resistance. Through his various mouthpieces, through the symbols displayed on banners and buildings, through the very structure of the realm itself, the message was reinforced constantly. Sauron was all-powerful. He would triumph over all enemies, and those who served him were on the winning side of an inevitable conflict. For the orcs and other creatures who believed this propaganda, it provided a kind of meaning to their existence. For men who had chosen to serve, it justified their choices and maintained their commitment. For those who served unwillingly, it was designed to break their hope and make resistance seem pointless. The library, in Barad-dûr, if it could be called such, contained knowledge gathered from conquered peoples, stolen manuscripts, and lore preserved from earlier ages. This was not a public repository, but rather a collection for Sauron's personal use and for those he permitted to study under his direction. The texts covered many subjects: history, linguistics, geography, accounts of battles and sieges, treatises on crafting and sorcery, genealogies of royal houses, and maps of lands both near and far. Some of these works were unique, the only surviving copies of ancient texts whose originals had been lost or destroyed elsewhere. When Barad-dûr fell, the fate of this library was unclear. Some texts may have been rescued and preserved, others were certainly destroyed in the collapse, and still others may have been scattered and lost. The concept of art or beauty was almost entirely absent from Mordor's culture. There were no paintings, no poetry, no music except crude war songs and marching chants. Architecture served function without aesthetics. Weapons might be well made from a technical standpoint, but were never decorated beyond perhaps crude symbols of authority or ownership. This absence reflected Sauron's nature. He was a craftsman of tremendous skill, but his creations were always tools of purpose, never expressions of beauty for its own sake. The ring itself exemplified this, supremely functional, imbued with tremendous power, but utterly plain in appearance. The contrast with elven culture, where beauty and functionality were seamlessly integrated, could not have been more stark. The night shifts in Mordor's various facilities, the forges, the guard posts, the fields, were often preferred by orcs, who found the darkness more comfortable than even the dim daylight that penetrated the region. During these hours, activity actually increased in many areas, for orcs worked more efficiently when the sun was down and the darkness was complete. Men who served alongside orcs in these shifts found the experience alienating, working by torch and firelight among creatures who saw better in the dark than humans could, hearing their harsh voices and crude humor, aware always that they were tolerated rather than accepted, present only because they served useful functions that the orcs could not or would not perform. The long-term effects of living in Mordor on human health were significant. The air quality caused respiratory problems, chronic coughs, difficulty breathing, lung diseases that could be fatal. The poor nutrition led to deficiencies and weakness. The psychological stress manifested in various ways: depression, anxiety, numbness, or outbursts of violence. Those who spent years in Mordor often aged prematurely, their bodies breaking down under the constant assault of environmental hazards and poor living conditions. Even those who eventually escaped and found their way to better circumstances often carried the marks of their time there: damaged lungs, scarred bodies, and psychological trauma that never fully healed. The question of children in Mordor was grim. Orcs reproduced and raised their young in the harsh culture described earlier. For human children born to those who served Sauron, life was equally hard. There was no formal education system, no concern for childhood development or well-being. Children were seen as future workers or soldiers, valued only for their potential utility. They were put to work as soon as they were physically capable, often in roles that were dangerous or demanding beyond their strength. Mortality among the young was high, and those who survived to adulthood were shaped by their experiences into individuals who knew no life except service and survival. The system of rewards in Mordor was minimal, but did exist. A warrior who showed exceptional valor or effectiveness might receive better rations, superior weapons, or command of a larger unit. A slave who exceeded production quotas might be beaten less frequently or given slightly better quarters. These small differentials, trivial by the standards of free societies, were significant within Mordor's harsh environment and helped maintain a degree of competition and striving among the inhabitants. But the rewards were never sufficient to provide real comfort or security, only to make existence marginally less terrible. ensuring that the pressure to continue serving remained constant. The moments of rest and respite that inhabitants of Mordor experienced were brief and closely supervised. Orcs might gather around fires to eat and to boast of their deeds, engaging in crude entertainment that often involved physical violence or mockery of the weak. Men might huddle together for companionship, sharing what little they had and finding what solace they could in human connection. But even these moments were temporary. The demands of labor and military service allowed little time for true rest, and the constant surveillance meant that gathering in groups was always potentially dangerous, for plotters and malcontents could use such opportunities to organize resistance, and Sauron's overseers were ever watchful for signs of such activity. The legacy of Mordor extended far beyond its physical boundaries and continued long after Sauron's final defeat. The memory of what had happened there, the knowledge that such evil could be organized and sustained, shaped the policies and philosophies of later ages. The kings of Gondor and Arnor, when those realms were restored, understood that vigilance against tyranny could never be relaxed, that power concentrated without accountability inevitably corrupted, and that the price of freedom was constant watchfulness. The ruins of Mordor stood as a monument to these lessons, a place that visitors might come to and reflect upon the consequences of choices made and the importance of standing against darkness even when the cost seemed unbearable and victory impossible. The transformation of Minas Ithil into Minas Morgul was not merely a change of garrison, but a corruption of the very stones and air of that place. When the Nazgul finally took the city in 2002 of the Third Age, after their 2-year siege, they did not simply occupy it, they reshaped it according to their nature. The white stone that had gleamed in moonlight began to glow with a pale, corpse-like luminescence that was visible for miles. The air grew cold, even in summer, and flowers would not bloom within its walls. The river that flowed past the city became tainted, its waters carrying a faint phosphorescence. Those who approached too closely reported feeling overwhelming dread, a sensation that intensified with proximity until it became almost physically unbearable. The city became a wound in the landscape, a place where the boundary between the living world and the wraith world had grown dangerously thin. The bridge that crossed the chasm before Minas Morgul's gate was ancient, built by the founders of Minas Ithil in the Second Age. It was wide enough for several horsemen to ride abreast, constructed of stone that had once been white but now appeared gray and weathered. The chasm it spanned was deep and narrow, carved by water over countless ages, and the sound of the stream far below echoed up from the darkness. To cross this bridge while the city was held by the Nazgul required tremendous courage, for one felt exposed and vulnerable, aware that eyes watched from the towers above, that at any moment a gate might open and riders emerge. During the War of the Ring, Frodo, Sam, and Gollum witnessed the Nazgul marching forth from this gate, a procession of terror that forced them to hide and wait, paralyzed by fear until the wraiths had passed. The troops that garrisoned Minas Morgul were among the most feared in Sauron's armies. They consisted of orcs specially selected for discipline and effectiveness, men from various conquered peoples who had proven their loyalty through long service, and of course, the Nazgul themselves when they were present. These forces conducted raids into Gondor's territory, ambushing patrols, attacking isolated settlements, and gathering intelligence. The garrison also maintained watch on the pass of Cirith Ungol, ensuring that Shelob remained undisturbed and that no one used that route to infiltrate Mordor. The mere existence of this garrison forced Gondor to maintain substantial military forces in response, tying down troops that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. The agricultural system around the Sea of Nurnen was more complex than simple slave labor in fields. There were overseers who managed the work, scribes who recorded production, engineers who maintained irrigation systems that brought water from the sea to the fields, and guards who prevented escape and ensured discipline. The crops grown were selected for their caloric value and their ability to grow in poor soil. Wheat, barley, and various root vegetables that could survive irregular watering and the thin, ash-laden soil. The harvest seasons were times of increased security, for this was when the year's food supply was determined, and any shortfall would directly impact Sauron's ability to maintain his armies. The workers in these fields lived in simple barracks, structures of wood or stone that provided minimal shelter but nothing more. The concept of family and kinship among Mordor's human inhabitants existed in attenuated form. Relationships formed, children were born, but the bonds that tied these individuals together were weakened by the constant insecurity and the knowledge that anyone could be separated from their loved ones at any moment through reassignment, death, or simple administrative caprice. Parents could not protect their children beyond teaching them to survive and to avoid attracting unfavorable attention. Spouses offered each other what comfort they could, but knew that emotional attachment was vulnerability in a place where vulnerability could be fatal. Some chose not to form such bonds at all, finding it easier to exist in isolation than to care for others they might lose. The Road of the Easterlings, one of the major routes into Mordor, came from the east through the pass in the arid Lithui. This road brought tribute, soldiers, and supplies from the lands of Rhûn, where many peoples served Sauron either from compulsion or from their own choice. The Easterlings who traveled this road were diverse. Some were light-skinned with fair hair, others dark, and they brought with them the customs and equipment of their homelands. They fought with different weapons and tactics than the Western armies they faced, and their presence in Sauron's forces added versatility to his military capacity. Many of these peoples had their own grievances against Gondor, stemming from conflicts that stretched back centuries, and they fought with the ferocity of those who believed they were settling old scores. The relationship between Mordor and the Corsairs of Umbar was one of alliance and mutual interest rather than direct control. Umbar, the great haven far to the south on the coast, had been founded by Númenóreans in the Second Age, but had long since fallen under the dominion of those who opposed Gondor. The Corsairs raided Gondor's southern coasts, attacking ships and settlements, and during the War of the Ring they sailed north to assault Pelargir. Sauron supported these activities and coordinated with the Corsairs, but he did not command them as he commanded his forces in Mordor. They were allies who shared an enemy rather than subjects who obeyed orders. This distinction would prove significant when Aragorn captured the Corsair fleet and turned it against Sauron's forces, for the Corsairs had no binding loyalty that would compel them to fight to the death. They were raiders and could be defeated militarily. The signals that flashed from the watchtowers of Mordor were visible across vast distances on clear nights. These signals used fire, mirrors, and shutters to create patterns that conveyed specific meanings. A watch commander, seeing an approaching enemy, could light a beacon that would be seen by the next tower in the chain, which would relay the message onward until it reached Barad-dûr. More complex messages required multiple signals in sequence, creating a code that trained observers could read and interpret. During the War of the Ring, this communication network functioned efficiently, providing Sauron with real-time intelligence about troop movements and threats. But the system also had weaknesses. If a tower was captured or destroyed, the chain was broken, and messages could not pass through that point until repairs were made or alternative routes established. The treatment of prisoners taken by Mordor's forces varied depending on their potential value. Common soldiers, if they survived capture at all, might be enslaved and put to work in the fields or forges. Officers and nobles were often brought to Barad-dûr for interrogation, for they possessed knowledge of enemy plans, troop strengths, and strategic intentions. Those with particular skills, engineers, healers, craftsmen, might be forced to work in their specialties under guard. The elderly and the very young who had no labor value were often simply killed, for feeding them served no purpose from Sauron's perspective. This ruthless pragmatism characterized all of Mordor's operations. Sentimentality and mercy were luxuries that served no function and were therefore absent. The few accounts that survived from those who had lived in Mordor and escaped described a landscape not just of physical hardship, but of spiritual oppression. They spoke of the way hope seemed to leach away in that place, how even the most determined will could be ground down by the relentless bleakness of each day. They described how they learned not to think too far ahead, for contemplating years or decades of such existence was unbearable. Instead, they focused on surviving each hour, each shift of labor, telling themselves they would endure just a little longer. Some found strength in small acts of kindness toward fellow sufferers, moments of shared humanity that reminded them they were more than just tools. Others withdrew into themselves, becoming numb and mechanical, their spirits retreating to some interior place where the external horror could not fully reach. The volcanic activity of Mount Doom was not constant, but rather followed cycles that could be observed and predicted to some degree. There were periods of greater activity, when lava flowed more freely from vents on the mountain's slopes, when the glow from the crater was brighter, and when the ground trembled more frequently. During these active periods, the heat in Gorgoroth increased noticeably, and the air became even more difficult to breathe. There were also quieter periods when the volcano seemed to slumber, though it never truly went dormant. Sauron's use of the mountain for forging the ring had occurred during one of these active periods when the fires burned hottest. Some scholars speculated that Sauron might have been able to influence the volcano's activity through his power, but this was never confirmed and might simply have been his knowledge allowing him to choose the optimal time for his work. The stars visible from Mordor on the rare clear nights were the same stars that shone over all of Middle-earth, but they seemed dimmer, more distant, their light struggling to reach through the atmospheric pollution. The elves, who loved the stars and whose awakening had occurred under starlight long before the first rising of the sun, would have found Mordor's sky particularly grievous, for it represented not just physical darkness, but a rejection of the beauty and order of the cosmos. The constellation of Manelmachar, which men called the swordsman and associated with one of the great heroes of old, could sometimes be glimpsed, but its stars were faint and wavering, barely distinguishable from the general darkness. For those trapped in Mordor, these occasional glimpses of stars were precious, brief connections to the wider world, and to beauty that Sauron could not fully extinguish. The logistics of moving armies from Mordor through the passes to attack western lands were complex and required extensive preparation. Troops had to be assembled, organized into units, equipped with weapons and armor, and provided with sufficient food for the march. The roads had to be cleared and maintained, for an army moves slowly at best and can be halted entirely by obstacles or poor conditions. Water sources along the route had to be identified and secured. Scouts had to survey the terrain ahead and watch for enemy forces that might attempt to interfere with the march. Once the army emerged from the passes, it faced the problem of sustaining itself in enemy territory, which required either bringing supply trains or living off the land through foraging and plunder. Sauron's ability to manage these logistics and to project military power far from his base demonstrated both his organizational capability and the extensive infrastructure he had built. The policy toward desertion in Sauron's forces was absolute and unforgiving. The penalty was death, usually administered in ways designed to serve as examples to others. A captured deserter might be tortured publicly before being killed, or displayed in some prominent location where his fate would be witnessed by many. This policy was necessary from Sauron's perspective, because his armies consisted largely of beings who served from fear rather than loyalty, and without harsh deterrence, desertion would have been endemic. But the policy also had costs. It created an atmosphere of paranoia where soldiers watched each other constantly, reporting any sign of wavering loyalty to curry favor with superiors. It also meant that tactical retreats could be difficult to execute, for soldiers who had been taught that running from battle meant death might continue fighting even when ordered to withdraw, unable to distinguish between legitimate orders and forbidden desertion. The rare merchants who were permitted to operate on Mordor's borders, trading with the garrison commanders and supplying goods that Mordor's internal economy did not produce, were a specialized and dangerous breed. They brought luxuries, wine, certain spices, specialized tools that could not be made within Mordor's borders. They accepted payment in loot taken from raids, in raw materials extracted from Mordor's mines, or in other goods that could be resold elsewhere. These merchants asked no questions about the origins of what they bought or the uses of what they sold. They were generally despised by the free peoples as collaborators with evil, but they justified their actions as purely commercial, claiming that if they did not trade, someone else would. After Sauron's fall, many of these merchants faced justice for their collaboration, though some managed to disappear into the vastness of Middle-earth, taking their ill-gotten wealth with them. The mines within and near Mordor extracted various ores, iron primarily, but also copper, tin, and other metals needed for Sauron's forges. Mining was dangerous work, conducted in conditions that were hot, unstable, and poorly ventilated. Cave-ins were common, as were injuries from tools or from the rock itself. Miners worked in shifts that extended for hours, far underground where no natural light penetrated, guided only by torches and lamps. The ore they extracted was hauled to the surface by teams of workers or by mechanisms of pulleys and counterweights, then transported to the forges where it would be smelted and worked. The miners themselves were usually slaves or orcs, working under the supervision of overseers who enforced production quotas. Life expectancy for a miner in Mordor was measured in years at best, for the combination of accidents, lung diseases from breathing rock dust, and general exhaustion claimed workers steadily. The phenomenon of the ring's pull on those susceptible to it was experienced differently by different individuals. For Isildur, who had taken the ring from Sauron's hand, it seemed to whisper of his right to possess it as weregild for his father's death. For Gollum, who had murdered to possess it, the ring became his precious, an object of obsessive love that consumed his entire existence. For Bilbo, who had found it by chance, the ring was troubling but not immediately corrupting, though over decades it extended his life while slowly working its influence. For Frodo, who inherited the burden, the ring grew heavier as he approached Mordor, not in physical weight but in psychological pressure, until at the very brink of its destruction he could no longer resist its power. For Samwise, who briefly carried it, the ring showed visions of power suited to his nature. Not armies or kingdoms, but a great garden, all the world transformed into a cultivated paradise under his care. Each experienced the ring's corruption tailored to their particular desires and fears, for the ring sought always to dominate, working through whatever psychological leverage it could find. The education of young orcs in warfare and survival was a brutal process that began early. They were taught to fight not through formal instruction, but through constant competition and violence within their own groups. The stronger survived and learned, the weaker died, or were driven to the margins. They learned to use weapons by fighting with them, to endure pain by experiencing it, to hate their enemies by being taught to hate, and by witnessing the hatred of their elders. There was no room for gentleness or hesitation. Such qualities were weaknesses to be beaten out or exploited. By the time an orc reached maturity, he had been shaped into an effective soldier, but also into a being whose capacity for cooperation was limited, who trusted no one fully, and who understood the world primarily through hierarchies of dominance. This made them effective in certain types of warfare, but also made them difficult to control except through fear and through the presence of stronger authority. The interaction between the various races serving Sauron, orcs, men, trolls, and others, was characterized by mutual contempt tempered by necessity. Orcs despised men, and men despised orcs, but they fought alongside each other because Sauron commanded it. The language barrier complicated cooperation, for orcs spoke their own dialects. Men spoke the common speech or their native tongues, and trolls had limited language capacity at all. Commands from higher authority were often passed through interpreters or through officers who spoke multiple languages. In battle, this diversity could be a weakness, for units that did not share language or culture coordinated poorly. But it also meant that Sauron's armies could draw on a wide range of tactics and fighting styles, using different forces for different purposes based on their particular strengths. The psychological impact of the eye upon those who came under its gaze was profound. To be looked upon by Sauron, to feel his attention focused directly upon oneself, was described as being laid bare, all secrets and thoughts exposed, all defenses stripped away. Frodo experienced this when he placed the ring on his finger at Amon Hen, and Sauron nearly found him, saved only by Gandalf's intervention. The mouth of Sauron and other high servants would have experienced this regularly, living with the knowledge that their master could probe their minds at any moment, ensuring their loyalty through the impossibility of hiding betrayal. This invasive awareness was another tool of control, making independent thought and planning almost impossible among those close to Sauron. For even contemplating, betrayal might be detected and punished. The roads within Mordor were engineered for military efficiency rather than comfort. They ran straight where possible, cutting through obstacles rather than going around them. The surfaces were hard-packed earth or stone, wide enough for columns of troops to march in formation. At regular intervals were mile markers, simple stones carved with numbers or symbols indicating distance to major destinations. Maintenance crews constantly worked to repair damage from weather and use, filling ruts, replacing stones, clearing obstacles. The main road from Barad-dûr to the Morannon was particularly well maintained, for it was the primary military artery of the realm. Secondary roads connecting to mines, forges, agricultural areas, and other facilities received less attention but were still kept functional. The existence of this road network allowed Sauron to move forces rapidly to respond to threats or to concentrate strength where needed. The process of smelting ore in Mordor's forges involved heating the raw material to high temperatures to separate metal from rock. The forges used both natural volcanic heat, channeled through vents and chambers, and traditional furnaces fueled by coal or wood brought from outside Mordor's borders. The work was hot, dangerous, and exhausting. Workers stood before furnaces that glowed with terrible heat, manipulating molten metal with long tools, pouring it into molds or working it on anvils. Burns were common, as were injuries from splashing metal or from heat exhaustion. The forges operated continuously, with shifts of workers replacing each other so that the fires never cooled. The volume of production was immense. Thousands of sword blades, spearheads, arrowheads, and armor pieces produced each day, feeding the insatiable demand of Sauron's military machine. The concept of time off or rest days did not exist in Mordor's labor system. Workers rested when their shift ended, sleeping in whatever accommodation was provided, then returned to work when called. There were no holidays, no celebrations, no recognition of seasons or traditional festivals. The only breaks in routine came when production demands lessened temporarily, or when some crisis required attention elsewhere. This relentless pace of labor contributed to the high mortality rate, for bodies and minds need rest to remain healthy, and the chronic deprivation of adequate rest led to accidents, illness, and early death. But from Sauron's perspective, individuals were replaceable. There were always more orcs breeding in the mountains, more captives taken in raids, more desperate men seeking work even in Mordor rather than starving elsewhere. The religious or spiritual beliefs of Mordor's inhabitants varied by race and background. Orcs, if they had any spiritual sense at all, seemed to worship or at least fear Sauron as a godlike being whose power was absolute. Men who served Sauron might have retained fragments of their original beliefs, but publicly they would not dare express any faith that contradicted their master's supremacy. There were no temples or shrines in Mordor, no priests or ceremonies of worship. Sauron himself, having been a Maya who served Morgoth, who had rebelled against Ilúvatar, represented a rejection of the true hierarchy of creation. He sought worship for himself, but offered nothing in return. No comfort or hope, only the promise of power to those who served him effectively. This spiritual emptiness contributed to the bleakness of Mordor. It was a realm without transcendence, without connection to anything beyond the material and the pursuit of dominion. The psychological warfare that Mordor employed against its enemies was sophisticated and effective. Captured prisoners might be tortured and then released, sent back to their own lines carrying tales of horror that would spread fear among the troops. Raids were conducted not just for military objectives, but to terrorize civilian populations, creating streams of refugees that burdened enemy resources and sapped morale. Propaganda was spread through various channels. Emissaries captured documents that were deliberately allowed to be recovered, rumors planted by spies. The message was always the same. Resistance was futile. Sauron's victory was inevitable. Surrender now while terms were still possible. This psychological assault was designed to work in parallel with military pressure, breaking enemy will even before decisive battles were fought. The question of what might have happened if Sauron had recovered the One Ring during the War of the Ring was debated by the wise. If he had regained it, his power would have been fully restored and increased beyond what he had possessed before. He would have been able to dominate all the other ring bearers absolutely, including the elves who wore the 3 rings. His armies would have been emboldened beyond measure, and his enemies would have been cast into despair. The free peoples would likely have been defeated piecemeal, unable to stand against the full might of a Sauron who possessed his complete power. Middle-earth would have fallen under darkness, and only in Valinor, across the sea, would light and freedom remain. And even that would be a diminished remnant, cut off from the mortal world forever. The stakes of Frodo's quest were thus absolute. Failure meant not just military defeat, but the end of the age and the triumph of tyranny over all the lands that mortals could reach. The role of chance and what some called fate in the War of the Ring was significant. Bilbo finding the ring in Gollum's cave, Frodo being chosen as ring-bearer, the exact timing of various events that brought aid when it was most needed. All these might be seen as fortunate accidents, or as evidence of a deeper pattern working through the world. Gandalf spoke of how even the wise cannot see all ends, suggesting that Gollum might yet have a part to play, and this proved true when Gollum's attack on Frodo in the Samath Naur resulted in the ring's destruction through his own fall into the fire. Whether this was Ilúvatar's hand working through the world, whether it was the natural consequence of the ring's corrupting nature turned against itself, or simply chance, could not be determined with certainty. But the outcome was the same. Evil destroyed through means that Sauron, for all his intelligence and power, never anticipated or guarded against.